glancing at Edward once to see him smirking at the white box I had uncovered. I lifted the white lid slowly, praying it wasn't something horribly expensive. There, sitting in a little bed of white tissue paper, was a shiny blue iPod. I smiled and gaped at it simultaneously.
"I've already put all your favorites on it,"
Edward said quietly from the headboard. I wanted to grimace at the thought of how much an iPod cost, but I knew that it would upset Edward, so I pushed that fact aside and smiled widely at him. Because I really did want an iPod. Thank you. I really did want one of my own. I smiled honestly. His face lit up a bit and he leaned over to put a small kiss on my cheek. I smiled wider and turned my face to give him one back. He chuckled and shook his head, leaning back against the headboard. I put the white lid back on the box and collected the used paper. I started hesitantly, fisting the used wrapping paper tightly. "I kind of got you something too," I whispered, chancing a peek up from the white box in my lap. Edward narrowed his eyes at me. "It's not expensive or anything," I quickly explained, watching as his eyes relaxed out of a glare. "It's more." I stared at the white box and fisted the paper in my hand harder. "Symbolic." I shrugged tensely. I darted my eyes to his nervously, where he was still sitting against the headboard, quirking an eyebrow at me. I let out a deep, anxious sigh, and plucked up the white box. I crawled off the bed and shuffled to my bag by the sofa, grimacing and blushing the entire way. I plunged my hand down into the bag, and fished out the small box, replacing it with the iPod. I stood with my back to the bed, staring at the small silver-wrapped box in my hand, and both blushed and glowered at it simultaneously. Reluctantly, I turned toward the bed, and began shuffling my way to it, praying he wouldn't go running if he figured it out. I climbed up on the mattress again, grasping the box, and crawled over to Edward, as he sat up and crossed his legs in the middle of the bed, glancing at the box curiously. Once I was in front of him, I crossed my legs back and sat the box down carefully in between us. It resembled some kind of disturbing offering. I took in the scene with equal parts of dread and anxiety. That one little silver box laying atop his comforter between our laps, summing up everything I felt for Edward. I had to fight the urge to snatch it back up and chunk it off the balcony. It was like slow motion as he reached his hand out and plucked it from the covers. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, making me dizzy, making my brain scream and plead to just rip it from his hands and run as far away as I could. But I sat there in front of him, completely paralyzed, as he began peeling the shiny silver wrapping paper from the box. I held my breath as he lifted the lid slowly and peered down into it curiously. He furrowed his brows and reached a finger down into the box, and lifted out the gift, that was so small, yet so enormously huge. I watched as the chain swayed precariously, making the shiny bronze ring hanging from the end of it swing through the air between us back and forth. Edward furrowed his brows and used his other hand to sweep the ring up to inspect it closer. "It's a clad earring," I blurted, blushing furiously, and really just kicking myself for not just buying him the sketchbook. "You don't actually have to wear it, or anything," I chuckled nervously. Edward stared at it blankly for a moment.
"What's the symbolism?"
he asked. "Because the universe still hated me." I let out a defeated sigh, weeping on the inside. "The hands," I started, fidgeting my fingers nervously. "The hands represent friendship." Edward glanced up at me from the ring and darted his eyes back to it quickly. "We had friendship. That was no big deal." The crown I trailed off, buying me some time. I began pulling at the ends of my sleeves anxiously. "The crown represents loyalty," I choked out as Edward still sat staring at the ring blankly. I bit my lip hard and began pulling at my sleeves rougher. "And the heart," I trailed off, shifting my gaze to my hands in my lap. "Well, I grimaced, realizing it was too soon for him to hear this from me, and there was no backing out of it now. I chanced to peek up at Edward while I still pulled and picked at my sleeves at my wrists. He was staring at me blankly, his dark green eyes unblinking.
The heart?
He asked quietly, his face completely void of any emotion. The smiles from before gone to somewhere else for the time being. I hated that it was coming out this way. I grimaced, and shifted my gaze back down to my hands. My face was so hot you could fry an egg on it. I gripped my sleeves tightly. The heart represents love. I choked, clasping my hands together until my knuckles were white. It was silent for a few moments as I was too afraid to chance any peeks at Edward. I never expected him to feel it back, or even say it, but I had anticipated many different reactions. So I braced myself.
You don't love me, Bella.
He said quietly in a monotone voice. I furrowed my brows at the covers beneath my lap, and tried to wrap my head around his statement. I don't love him. And something about hearing him deny it, and completely dismiss my own feelings made something click inside of me, completely cemented the reality of the whole idea into my head. I was in love with Edward. And how dare he tell me my own feelings? I snapped my head up and lifted my chin, staring at his blank and emotionless face, and growing even more offended by the second. Don't tell me what I feel, I growled, narrowing my eyes and hating that the motionless mask he was hiding behind. He sat there motionless for a moment, before he shook his head at me, still dismissing my own feelings. And that just made me angrier. I love you, I glared. And saying it felt like the most normal and comfortable thing in the world. Because it was completely and utterly true. Without warning. Anger flashed in Edward's eyes, and he clenched his jaw, glowering at me, and balling his fists around the silver wrapping paper he held in his hand. Even the messy bronze hair falling in his face looked darker. He narrowed his dark green eyes.
Don't you ever fucking say that again.
He sneered. I flinched away from his voice, completely shocked that he was reacting with all of this anger. I had prepared myself for some form of rejection, but I hadn't expected him to get so furious with me. His posture had become completely rigid, sitting right in front of me, seething. I refused to let his irrational anger affect my conviction. I love you, I said, determinedly, watching. As the anger in his eyes grew more defined, the muscles in his arms were bulging, and he leaned towards me on the bed, glaring right into my eyes, flaring his nostrils. Anyone else would have been terrified. But I wasn't. Not of Edward.
You don't even fucking know me?
He growled in a threatening voice. I should have been hurt by his reaction, but I couldn't get past the incredulity of his statement. I gaped into his furious eyes, watching. As he breathed heavily, nearly shaking with anger. What are you talking about? Of course I know you, I said incredulously. I didn't like how my voice shook when I said it. As if I was unsure of that fact, when I really wasn't. His eyes narrowed further, and he took the fist with the silver paper in it, and flicked it, sending the ball of trash flying off the bed. His dark green eyes glared in anger as he reached up over his shoulder and yanked on the black t-shirt he was wearing. All I could do was sit and stare at him while he yanked the shirt off his back and tore it off his head, momentarily breaking our stare down as he lifted it off. He took the shirt and threw it across the room. I gawked at his stomach and chest, seeing more of the burn scars that I had only caught a glimpse of before. It covered half of his chest, and most of his stomach. I stared at his chest as it rippled and heaved in anger, and something I was assuming was self-disgust, which was just ridiculous. Because even with the scars, Edward was gorgeous. Lean and muscular, covered with inches upon inches of pink scar tissue, that merely marred his skin, but didn't disfigure him in any way. I met his heated gaze, and lifted my chin, and rounded my shoulders back. Scars wouldn't scare me away. I had scars covering most of my body too. They meant nothing to me.
I'm just as ugly on the inside, Bella,
he said in a scarily calm voice, clenching his fists at his sides. And I probably should have done a lot of things in that moment. But the absurdity of that statement made me snort. He got impossibly angrier, leaning into me more. He had a frighteningly calm mask cover